All right, everyone. Today we are continuing Unit 2, Colonial America, and this lesson is going to cover one of the most serious and difficult topics in American history, labor and slavery in the colonies. Before we begin, I want to make something very clear. Slavery did not begin in colonial America. In fact, slavery is older than written history itself. Almost every major civilization throughout history practiced some form of slavery or forced labor at some point. Ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, African kingdoms, Asian empires, Native American groups, and European societies all used systems of slavery or servitude in different ways. That does not make slavery right. It was wrong then, and it is wrong now. But when studying history, we have to examine the world as people at the time understood it, rather than only through a modern lens. We also need to recognize something important. Slavery and human trafficking still exist today. In fact, historians and human rights organizations estimate that more people are trapped in forced labor and modern slavery around the world today than at any other point in history because of the size of the global population. So this is not just ancient history. It is part of a much larger human story about power, economics, labor, and human rights. Now, with that understanding, let's examine labor in colonial America. When the English colonies first developed, they needed workers, building settlements, farming crops, cutting timber, constructing homes, and growing plantations required huge amounts of labor. At first, the colonies relied heavily on indentured servants. Indentured servants became the first major imported labor force in many colonies. An indentured servant was a person who signed a contract agreeing to work for a certain number of years in exchange for passage to America. Many indentured servants came from Europe, especially England. Some were poor people hoping for opportunity in the New World. Others were prisoners, debtors, or people escaping difficult lives in Europe. In theory, after completing their contract, indentured servants would gain freedom and sometimes land or wages, but reality was often much harsher. Many servants worked under brutal conditions. Employers could charge them for food, clothing, shelter, and supplies, sometimes making it difficult to ever fully pay off their contracts. Some servants died before ever gaining freedom. Others ran away and tried to settle land on their own. Now, eventually, the colonies began shifting toward another labor system, African labor and slavery. But the earliest Africans brought to English North America were not slaves in the exact way we often imagine later plantation slavery. In 1619, a ship carrying Africans arrived in Virginia. Some of these Africans appear to have initially been treated more similarly to indentured servants, especially during the early years before racial slavery became fully legalized and institutionalized. Some Africans could earn freedom, own property, marry, and even eventually own land themselves. One of the most important examples is Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was an African man who arrived in Virginia during the early colonial period. He eventually gained his freedom, acquired land, and became a successful tobacco farmer. At one point, Johnson himself even owned indentured servants and became involved in a major legal case connected to labor and slavery. In 1655, a court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson in a dispute over a laborer named John Cassar. The court ordered that John Cassar be returned to Johnson for life. Many historians view this case as one of the earliest legal examples in English North America where a court officially recognized lifetime servitude tied to race and slavery. Over time, colonial laws changed dramatically. Colonies increasingly created racial slave codes that permanently tied slavery to African ancestry. Slavery slowly transformed from a system that sometimes resembled indentured labor into a hereditary, race-based system where enslaved status passed from parent to child. Now, let's talk about the triangular trade. The triangular trade connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European manufactured goods were traded in Africa. Africans were traded for and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the colonies. The colonies then sent raw materials such as tobacco, rice, sugar, and other products back to Europe. This trade system became enormously profitable. The passage across the Atlantic Ocean aboard slave ships became known as the Middle Passage. Conditions aboard these ships were horrific. People were crowded tightly together for voyages that could last over 2 months. Disease spread rapidly. Food and sanitation were extremely limited. Many people died during the journey before ever reaching the Americas. Now, all of this connected directly to mercantilism, Remember, mercantilism was the economic system where colonies existed to increase the wealth and power of the mother country. England controlled colonial trade and resources in order to strengthen its economy. Colonies supplied raw materials while England manufactured finished goods. Labor became essential to keeping this system profitable. Now let's discuss what life was like for enslaved people in colonial America. Politically, enslaved people had no voting rights and almost no legal protections. Economically, enslaved people were treated as property under colonial law. Families were often separated through sale. People lived with the constant fear of punishment or being sold away from loved ones. Socially, enslaved Africans were often viewed as outside the colonial definition of citizenship and identity. At the same time, enslaved people still formed communities, family connections, religious traditions, and ways of resisting oppression. Resistance took many forms. Some enslaved people slowed their work, damaged tools or crops, escaped, or openly rebelled. Colonial governments responded with harsh punishments, including whippings, imprisonment, mutilation, and forced sale. Laws heavily restricted enslaved people. In many colonies, they could not own firearms, testify against white colonists in court, strike a white person, or freely buy and sell goods. Now, it is important to understand that not all African Americans in the colonies were enslaved. There were also free African Americans. Conditions for free African Americans varied greatly depending on the colony and time period. Politically, they still faced discrimination and had very limited rights. Economically, some worked as laborers or craftsmen, while others managed to own land, homes, or businesses. A small number even became wealthy property owners and even slave owners themselves. Socially, free African Americans helped build churches, communities, and institutions that became important parts of American life. Later in American history, many free African Americans became major voices against slavery. Figures such as Frederick Douglass, Richard Allen, and David Walker spoke and wrote powerfully about freedom and equality. Some African Americans also participated in the Underground Railroad and fought during the American Revolution. When studying labor in colonial America, we have to understand that economics drove many of these systems. Colonies wanted labor because labor created wealth. Plantations, trade, farming, and mercantilism all depended on workers. Over time, slavery became deeply woven into the economic foundation of many colonies, especially in the South. This created systems and inequalities that would continue shaping American history for centuries. Understanding this history is uncomfortable at times, but it is necessary. To truly understand colonial America, we must understand both the opportunities and the injustices that existed at the same time. That complexity is part of history.